I can barely breathe as it is. Why did I think it was a good idea to film a video? I'm back again reading more Reddit scary story things, only this time from r/nosleep. I'm just asking to be sleep deprived at this point. I would like to point out just before we start this, I am sick, so the voice isn't great right now, so I apologise. Real quickly though, as always, if you can, please like, comment and subscribe. It helps me out a bunch and I really genuinely appreciate it. Also, you can follow my Twitter to see what I get up to when I'm not filming videos. So yeah, my @ is on screen now and I'll leave it in a link in the description. But yeah, let's start reading some stories. Somebody has been leaving notes around my house. They're starting to freak me out. They started innocently enough. Don't forget your keys, read the first message, scrawled on a sticky note in loopy letters. It had been left on my fridge door. It immediately grabbed my attention because at the time I lived alone. I had no memory of writing it and the handwriting didn't match mine or anyone I knew. I was slightly perturbed but wasn't sure on how to react. In the end, I just tossed the note and went to work. The second note came a few days later, left on my kitchen counter. The sticky note was pink this time but still had the same distinctive loopy handwriting. Make sure to pack your lunch today. Again, I was unsettled. Now, any normal person might have reported this to police, but during that time I was going through a major depressive spell. I moved to a new city away from my friends and family and had started a new job that I quickly realised I hated and didn't nearly pay enough. Home was lonely and work was soul-crushing. I had trouble enough getting out of bed each morning, let alone filing a report that I'm sure the police would not take seriously. Even more stressed, I crumpled up the note. However, I ended up packing a small lunch for myself. Usually I didn't bother to put in the effort and just ate cafeteria food. But against my better judgment, I fulfilled the wishes of the note. That day, the cafeteria was closed. The main cafeteria fridge had broken overnight, and many of the frozen lunches inside had gone bad. Management thought it would be better to shut it down for the day. A feeling of unease settled in my stomach after learning the news. It was as if the note had predicted it. The notes continued throughout the following weeks. They would typically show up on random days, no more than 3 notes to a day. They were all left in obvious places in my apartment, all on sticky notes and in that unfamiliar loopy handwriting. It began to grow more prophetic. Take I-80 today, there will be a bad accident on your way home. Janet is going to offer you some cookies at the office. Politely decline, they will give you food poisoning. Mary has been on a diet, compliment her on her weight loss. She'll end up thinking well of you. Of course I tested the notes to see if they were accurate. Every time I ignored their advice, whatever it warned me against came true. One day a note said to pack an umbrella, and I purposefully didn't. It was forecast to be sunny that day, so any normal person wouldn't think to pack one. But sure enough, I got soaked that evening walking to my car. I was incredibly curious about the notes. There were so many questions I had about them, and those unanswered questions kept festering in my head. I tried writing notes back in return and leaving them out, but never got a response. I'd speak out loud and ask questions as if, or in case, the note writer could somehow hear me, but this only made me feel foolish. I'd occasionally make a surprise visit home at odd hours just to see if I could catch the note writer leaving their notes. Of course, I never caught them. I tried installing cameras in my apartment, even making sure all of the cameras were completely hidden, but the next day I found every single one of the cameras' insides completely torn out and placed on the kitchen table with a single note next to them reading, "Never do that again." The notes stopped coming after that, which made me deeply regretful. I had grown accustomed to the notes. I had begun to rely on them even. They had significantly improved my way of life over the last few months, both mentally, financially, and socially. I had actually started making friends at the office thanks to their advice, and for the first time in my life, I was even a bit popular. My managers, who before the notes didn't pay much interest in me, now valued my presence and would ask for my opinion on projects. It was no secret I was on my way to a promotion. Could I still do that without the notes? I also valued the notes as a friend, as weird as that sounds, or more like a guardian angel. Wherever they were from, they were always protecting me. Without them, the future was suddenly unknown, dangerous. Every time some mild annoyance popped up from that point, from bad traffic to stressful work situations or even a minor paper cut, I thought about how this all probably could have been avoided if I still had the notes. The next week, a bright green sticky note appeared on my bathroom mirror. "Don't forget to call Mom today, it is her birthday." I nearly cried. I decided to sack my investigation and just accept things as they were. Slowly, the fog of my depressive spell began to lift and I could feel myself returning to how I used to be. My confidence rose and for the first time in a while I felt in equilibrium with my life. I went out, cracked jokes and even managed to clean up my apartment. I also managed to get a girlfriend somehow. Her name was Amanda. I met her at a pub when I was out with my buddies. The best part of all of this is that for some reason she seemed to actually be into me. She was gorgeous, way out of my league really, with long auburn hair that reached down to her back with soft brown eyes. Her laugh was lovely and the lemon-scented perfume she liked to wear was intoxicating. She was the type of girl that you could chat with for hours and never run out of things to talk about. The relationship was still new, so I was trying not to plan our whole future together in my head, but she was so lovable it was hard not to. At some point I briefly thought about telling her about the notes. I've always wanted to tell someone about it, but never really had anyone to tell up until now. I decided not to, however, afraid she might think I was crazy. There was no point so early in the relationship making her think I was a loon. Plus, I was afraid if the notes might stop again. If whoever was leaving them clearly didn't want me looking into them, how would they react if I shared what was happening with somebody? So at that moment, I kept it to myself. Amanda had a hobby of cooking and had invited me to her house on Saturday for, in her words, the best fucking spaghetti you'll ever eat. I was pumped since this is the first time I would actually visit her house. I was in a good mood that evening as I was getting ready for the date. I hummed to myself thinking about how lovely this was going to be and went downstairs to grab my keys. On the kitchen counter there was a new hot pink sticky note. I picked it up instinctively. Kill your girlfriend. My brain stopped for a moment. I read it once, twice, and a third time. The words flashing in my brain but hitting an error every time. I set the note down and gulped, feeling nauseous. Anxiously, I went to my car and started driving. I tried not to think about the note, but the words kept circling in my mind. Kill your girlfriend. The notes had never failed me before, and they were always in my best interest as far as I knew, which was admittedly not much. Maybe they were wrong this time. Maybe it wasn't meant to be taken literally. Kill could be a synonym for breakup, right? My mind kept trying to make up poor excuses the whole way there. By the time I arrived, I was a sweaty mess and not a lick calmer. I pulled down my sun visor to check my face, and a bright green sticky note fluttered out. I went cold. The notes had never appeared outside my house before. Hands shaking, I picked up the note and it read, Kill Amanda. Take the gun from your glove box and shoot her. I looked at my glove box wide-eyed. I did indeed keep a handgun in my glove box for safety purposes. I wanted to puke. To believe this wasn't happening. Again, I ignored the note and walked up to Amanda's house, trying to shake the message from my mind. She answered the door almost immediately after I rang the doorbell. Hey, what's up? She said with a bright smile. But when she saw my face, the smile dropped. You okay, Gary? What's wrong? She said in concern. Nothing, I lied, trying to force a smile. Well, actually, I think I might have a bit of a stomachache. Come in, she said, ushering me in. The inside of her house was cute and homely, and she fretted over me worriedly as she led me over to her kitchen table. She then took my hand and rubbed it comfortingly. If you're not filling up to spaghetti, we can always have it another time. Don't worry about it. Do you want any antacids or something? I smiled. The way she was so concerned for me over a simple stomachache made me fall in love with her all over again. My heart panged with both love and guilt. The aroma of cooked spaghetti was also extremely strong. And even though she said it was fine, I knew it would probably be a bummer for her to pack away all the spaghetti after just making it. I'm fine, sweetie. I probably have a stomachache because I haven't eaten much today. I was looking forward so much for your spaghetti. Her smile returned again. I always loved how fast she smiled at things. Well then, Mr. Hungry, let me grab you a bowl. She left for the kitchen. I reclined back inside, sticking my hands in my pockets. I felt a crinkle of paper. Shit. I pulled the paper out of my right pocket. Take your chair and bash her in the head. I had a hard time controlling my breathing and I stuffed the note back in my right pocket. I also felt paper in my left pocket, and against my mind screaming for me not to, I pulled it out, realising that it was actually two notes crinkled together. Shakily, I unwrinkled the first note. Do not eat the spaghetti. Drugged. What's that, Gary? Asked Amanda behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I stuffed the notes back in my left pocket. Oh, just some note from work I forgot was in my pocket is all, I said in a weird voice. She frowned, looked like she wanted to say something, but then thought better of it. Here, babe, she said, gently handing me a bowl of spaghetti. It looked heavenly. I wanted to puke. She sat next to me with her own bowl. She rested her head in her hands and looked at me excitedly, expectantly. I stared at her blankly. Well, take a bite, silly, she said, gesturing towards my bowl. I'm so sorry. I really need to use your bathroom. I jumped up and started looking for a bathroom. She jumped up after me, looking confused. Gary, what's wrong? You've been acting weird. When I found the right door, I went in and locked the door behind me. She kept knocking and knocking. Gary, seriously, what's wrong with you? Is a stomachache that bad? Talk to me, Gary, please. I backed up against the bathroom wall and sank down to the floor. I pulled out the two notes from my left pocket again. This time reading the second note, my heart sank. She is not Amanda. I swear I've heard a story like that before. I don't think it was that exact one, but it was near enough the same thing of someone just waking up finding sticky notes everywhere around their house, just letting them know things. I can't remember what the story was, but it was just freakishly similar to that one. Not so much towards the end, but just the preface of someone finding sticky notes around their apartment. I thought my apartment was haunted. The truth is so much worse. In retrospect, it should have been obvious from the start that there was something going on. It was my first time renting an apartment, but even I thought that the landlord was eager for me to move in as soon as possible. Rent was ridiculously low for the area, the apartment itself was in pristine condition, and the whole process from touring the apartment to moving only took about a week. Nothing like that comes without a catch. Apartment 311 was a pleasant place to live at first. It had 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and since I lived alone, that meant I got to convert 1 bedroom into my own office space. It came with a handful of paintings already, so it didn't even have the off-putting liminal feeling that some empty apartments have. The only immediate downside I could tell from the start was that there was a slight smell in the living room from time to time. It wasn't anything too noticeable, but you would occasionally get a faint whiff of some sort of musty odour. I was living in apartment 311 for a couple weeks before I noticed anything was wrong. It started off with simple stuff like various knickknacks being placed on the wrong shelves, snacks and small objects going missing, things like that. Once or twice I found the fridge left open. These things would only happen when I was asleep, and it made me feel like I was going crazy. There was no way anyone could be breaking into my apartment just to steal some useless scrap and move around some collectibles. The door was locked whenever I went to bed, and even if someone hypothetically had a key, I always made sure to bolt the door as well. I considered getting some security cameras set up, but I balked at the price when I looked into that possibility. Though the apartment was admittedly cheap, between rent and utilities I still couldn't afford to set up an entire security system. I tried to put it out my mind, assuming that maybe I was just sleepwalking or getting up for a midnight snack and forgetting by the next morning. I'd never been an easy sleeper. I was often prone to night terrors and other disturbances, which had only gotten worse now that I was in an unfamiliar environment. Of all the sleep problems I've experienced, by far the least pleasant is sleep paralysis. It used to happen fairly rarely, maybe once every 2 to 3 months, but after moving to the apartment it became almost a weekly occurrence. Now, usually my sleep paralysis is fairly mild. I find myself unable to move, eyes open, and I find it difficult to breathe. Sometimes I feel like there is a presence in the room with me, but before I moved I had never experienced any form of hallucinations, visuals or otherwise. I'd never seen a ghost, monster, hag or any other sort of entity while I was paralysed. It was only ever a sense of dread and total paralysis of the body. That changed about the same time I noticed the missing food and misplaced objects. As usual, it felt like I had woken up but couldn't move a single muscle. It was hard to breathe and I had this awful feeling like I wasn't alone. I tried to calm myself down, to remind myself that I'd been through this before and it always wound up okay, but something felt different. It was then that I noticed the door to my bedroom slowly opening inch by inch. I could hear the creak of hinges as it swung inward. Someone or something was coming into my room. He peeked his head around at first, dull eyes reflecting a faint glow of moonlight from my bedroom window. He was bald with pale, flaky skin. I wanted to scream when I saw his expression, but I was still a prisoner of my own body. The man had a full rictus grin on his face, chipped yellow teeth clenched tightly together, grinding against one another. I watched in horror as the rest of the man's body slowly passed into the room, tiptoeing as if he were creeping up behind someone in a cartoon. The man was utterly emaciated, almost skeletal in appearance, and covered in sores and pockmarks. He was stark naked and smeared in dirt and filth. I could do nothing but watch as he slowly inched ever closer towards me until I could feel his hot breath upon my face. It smelled like the musty odour I sometimes detected in the living room. Not once did I see his expression change. He didn't even blink as he stared at me, and I could feel hatred radiating off him like heat from a furnace. He just stood there, looking at me for what felt like hours. Eventually he turned around and slowly sneaked back out of the room, gently shutting the door behind him. A few minutes later I started to be able to move again, the paralysis wearing off as my body started to wake up properly. I had to call in sick to my job that day. The experience was such a shock to me that there was no way in hell I'd be able to get any work done. I spent a good hour just checking every room to make sure I was entirely alone. I searched in the closet, underneath the sinks, in my office, anywhere I thought someone could be hiding. When I found nothing, I managed to convince myself it was all an hallucination and I was safe. Things continued the same for a while after that. Objects still went missing from time to time, the smell in the living room stayed just as musty as it ever was, and about every week or so I'd have another sleep paralysis incident. Of course, now every time I did experience sleep paralysis, I'd have to see my unwanted visitor again. I named him Jimmy to try and reduce the terror a little bit. Putting a silly name to a horrifying face helped lessen my fear slightly. As far as sleep paralysis hallucinations went, Jimmy wasn't too bad once I started to get used to him. He never touched me or sat on my chest like some people's nightmares did. He just stood and stared. It was still deeply unpleasant, mind you, but I felt lucky that it was a consistent kind of unpleasantness at least. Then I found the photograph. I noticed it underneath a pile of papers while I was doing some cleaning up. A picture of 2 women embracing in front of a waterfall. I didn't recognise either of the women and I assumed it must have been from a previous tenant. I texted the landlord, Greg, and asked if he still had the old tenant's phone number so I could give her a call. He obliged and within a few minutes I was calling her. She picked up after a couple of rings sounding slightly exasperated. Hello, this is Rebecca. Who is this? Hi, my name is Flora. I'm the current tenant of apartment 311. I think that you may have left a photograph behind you when you moved. I was wondering if you'd want to pick it up or I could mail it to you or something. There was a long pause on the other end of the phone. Hello? I asked. You need to get out of that apartment. You're not safe. I honestly didn't have any response but to laugh. Is this some kind of joke? I asked her between chuckles. I heard her sigh with frustration. It's not a joke. I'm serious. Things have been going missing, right? That got my attention. How do you know that? It happened with me too. My girlfriend and I kept noticing things being moved or disappearing while we were asleep. Little things mostly. Snacks, trinkets, nothing major. Now, I never saw this, but my girlfriend swears that one time when she got up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water, she saw this naked man just staring at her. He was covered in sores and looked more like a corpse than a person. She woke me up and we called the police, of course, but they didn't find anything. I think... Rebecca paused for a moment, choosing her words. What? What is it? I asked, increasingly panicked. I began to worry that Jimmy was just more than a simple hallucination. I think 311 is haunted. We asked around some of the other residents, and apparently the last guy to live there just disappeared. Our best guess is that he must have died and his spirit just never left. My girlfriend is into some occult stuff, so she tried a cleansing ritual or something like that, but it didn't work. Things kept disappearing, and eventually we just decided to move. I hung up the phone. It was rude, sure, but I was just so shocked that I didn't know what to do. At the very least, I began to understand why I got this apartment for so cheap. I found myself sitting on the couch for a while, occasionally getting a whiff of the musty smell. I stared blankly at a painting on the wall, one of the ones which was already there when I first moved in. It depicted a woman in a white dress sitting underneath a tree reading a book. I couldn't tell what was making me so focused on it. It seemed utterly unrelated to what was happening. Eventually I snapped out of it and went to my office to do some research. After a little bit of digging, I found some information regarding the tenant who lived here before Rebecca. The one who disappeared. Apparently some of his co-workers put out a missing persons report 6 months ago. His name was Michael Hansen, and I gasped when I saw a photograph of him. He looked exactly like Jimmy, albeit not so emaciated and filthy. I hastily packed some of my things and made arrangements to stay at a friend's house for a couple nights, telling them that my apartment had a roach problem and that the landlord needed to fumigate it. I called into work and gave them some sob story about an uncle dying. Enough to get a time off for a few days. With no more distractions from the ghost of Michael Hansen, I slept soundly on my friend's couch, unbothered by any sleep paralysis. The next 2 days were spent researching. I checked out dozens of books on folklore and the occult from the local library, scoured paranormal internet forums, and even watched a few episodes of some cheesy ghost hunting TV show. I was determined to figure out a way to put this spirit of Michael Hansen to rest. The stories were all wildly different, with countless potential solutions to my problem. Some sources said salt was a surefire way to banish spirits, others said iron was a good ghost repellent, but most simply said that I should give up and move. However, one myth piqued my interest. According to some beliefs, the spirits of the unquiet dead could be tied to objects from their life, binding them to the place where the object resided. If the object which their soul was bound to was destroyed, it freed their spirit and they could move on to the afterlife. I remembered the paintings. I had assumed they were all put there by the landlord, but it was just as possible they could be left there by Michael. I arrived back to the apartment, determined to grab the paintings and burn them, laying Michael Hansen's soul to rest once and for all. I felt like some sort of hero, a badass monster hunter who saved the day with her intuition and a little bit of book smarts. One by one I pulled the paintings off the walls, putting them into a cardboard box. I made a mental note to buy some lighter fluid on the way to the empty lot where I planned to burn them. I approached the final painting, the one which showed the woman in a white dress beneath the tree. I pulled it off the wall and recoiled as the musty smell increased in intensity. Staring in confusion, I saw a small rectangular hole where the painting used to be, about 4 feet off the ground and 2 feet by 2 feet in length and width. I shuddered in fear, remembering that Michael's body was never found. Perhaps he was murdered, his corpse hidden in the walls by some unknown assailant. I nervously flicked on my flashlight, peered within the hole and screamed. I ran out of the apartment 311 as fast as I could before calling the police, sobbing in terror. I was prepared to find a body, maybe cut up into little pieces and wrapped in duct tape. I was ready for death and decay and rot. There is something fascinating about ghosts, something somehow romantic about the notion that part of someone could live on Earth after death. There was nothing romantic about seeing the clenched tooth grimace of Michael Hansen glaring at me with hate as he stood in the small section of a hollow wall, which he had been living in for the past 6 months. No, the image that I have got right now in my head is not an image that I ever wanted. I mean, this subreddit wasn't lying. I'm definitely not going to sleep after this. I found out why my grandpa keeps drapes over his mirrors. Growing up, my grandpa always kept drapes over the mirrors in his house. I was a kid and he had a big house. I just assumed it was a fancy decoration. We moved before I was too old and I kind of forgot about it. Once I was 15, he came to visit our house and my mum had helped me cover all the mirrors in our house. Your grandfather has a phobia of mirrors was all she said of the topic. I knew this was out of the ordinary now, and one night while we were sitting in the living room together, I just blurted it out. Why are you afraid of mirrors? Oh, your mother probably wouldn't want me to tell you. It's not a nice story. Let's just say they remind me of your grandmother and leave it at that. Come on, I'm practically an adult. I can handle it. Well, okay, maybe. When your mum was just a kid, we found this mirror. My mum walked into the room and glared at him. I brought you two some dessert. You're not telling her that story, are you? She's too young to hear all of that. She handed us some ice cream and my grandpa didn't budge again. I tried to get him or my mum to tell me for the following year or two. Every rejection added more intrigue to the story. The story is about your grandmother leaving us. It's painful for us to talk about, my mum offered once after I had pestered her about it. I understood then why nobody wanted to talk about it and over time I lost the desire to hear. I almost forgot about it until this morning. My grandpa called me last week to tell me he had a heart attack. He was okay and being discharged. I asked him if I could visit. This morning I arrived to his house from the airport to find the familiar drapes drawn over all the mirrors. My curiosity came back, but I couldn't ask an old man that had just had a heart attack to reminisce about the love of his life leaving him. I didn't have to ask. I never told you the story about the mirror, he said after we had finished catching up with each other and sitting in an awkward silence. I think now is as good a time as any. I might have long left. They gave you a pacemaker, Grandpa. You'll be fine. I'm still at 89 years old. I didn't have a reassuring response for that, so I just nodded. He started the story. We had just moved into our first real house after living in the basement apartment of my parents' house. Your mother was about 6 and really needed her own room. We bought an old house, too remote to be called the suburbs, but I didn't mind the extra commute to give the family some breathing room. We were still considering having more children, and with our own house, it seemed possible. The place was a fixer-upper, but your grandma had a knack for it. She repainted inside and out, fixed lights, decorated, furnished the place beautifully, and even managed to fix the plumbing in one of the bathrooms on her own. There was an unfinished basement, and we got the idea in our heads to fix it up and turn it into an entertaining space. While we were preparing the space to start work and getting it inspected for asbestos, we found that one of the walls was built inside the foundation. It wasn't like a false wall, it was real, but it wasn't part of the original foundation, so we tore it down for the extra 10 foot or so of floor space. There was an antique mirror back there, one of those self-standing mirrors with a swivel covered with a sheet. The thing must have been as old as the house, maybe older. We talked about having it appraised to see if it was worth anything, but decided to keep it as a talking piece. We finished the basement and set up the mirror as a decoration. At our celebration get-together, we realised there was something strange about the mirror. The reflections were off, like a funhouse mirror. One guy would be stretched too tall, another too short, and one of your grandmother's girlfriends had no face. It was kind of creepy, but kind of funny, like a defective mirror. We kept using that space for weekend gatherings. Your grandma would cook some hors d'oeuvre, and we'd have some drinks. The mirror was always a fun little attraction. This is where it gets strange. I guess the mirror was contagious or something, because the other mirrors in the house started to play with reflections. Sometimes my hair would look fine, but when I started driving back to work, I would notice it was a mess. One time, I saw 2 of me standing there. I got out of the house to go to work at least. Your grandmother was constantly assaulted by the mirror. She would tell me that she was obese or her hair was falling out, and she looked the same she always had. I tried telling her she was just as beautiful as I had ever seen her, but when your own reflection is playing tricks on you, how can you believe that? She even told me one time that the mirror had tried to grab her and pull her in. I wrote it off as crazy. Our anniversary was coming up, so I came up with a plan to help bring the magic back. I got one of the neighbour girls to watch your mother and took your grandma out to dinner and dancing at a new restaurant. They had floor-to-ceiling mirrors throughout the place. When your grandmother saw her reflection in those mirrors, she sobbed. I thought I had messed up, but then she kissed me. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you. I haven't seen me in so long." "This is how I always see you, baby," I said back. Sorry about the romantic stuff, but that night, that was the last time we were happy. It was amazing, like when we had first met. My grandpa was crying now. I may have been too. "Are you sure you want to keep going, Grandpa?" "You need to know," he said. He wiped his eyes and began again. "When we got home, the sitter was a wreck. She was screaming about how she and your mother were playing hide and seek, but your mother had been hiding without being found for 3 hours. You hear these horror stories of kids locking themselves in dryers and things. We panicked and split up to search the house, calling her name. Your grandmother went to search in the basement, and after I had looked through your mother's room, I went down to check on her. She was sitting in front of the antique mirror, sobbing and screaming at it, 'Give me my daughter back. Please take me instead.' I was walking up to her and said, 'Baby, what's going on?' And she said, 'She's in there. I see her. It took her. Give me back my daughter.' I was almost to the point I could see the reflection when the sitter yelled down the stairs that she had found your mother in her room, hiding under the bed. I had checked under the bed, so that meant your mother had been running around actively avoiding us. I was pissed, especially seeing the state your grandmother was in over it. She was probably 10 by then. She should have known better. We both ran upstairs and gave her a hug, but I told her she was grounded for a month and she'd know better not to make us worry like that. She just looked at her feet and apologised. After that, your grandmother became convinced that your mother had been replaced that night. She told me that your mother had started writing with her left hand instead of her right. There was a scar on her left ankle that had switched sides too. Finally, she told me that she kept seeing our real daughter in the mirror in the basement, so she must have been replaced by something else. I talked to her about getting therapy and she stopped talking to me about it. I came home one day to your mother locked in her room when your grandmother pounded on the door with a kitchen knife in her hand. She was saying, "Give me back my daughter, you bitch." I tried to talk to her, but she lunged at me with the knife and accused me of being replaced too. I didn't know what to do, so I called 911. It killed me to do it. Your grandmother looked at me with this hurt expression, one I'll never forget, as I hung up the phone. She ran into the basement. I stood by the door to the basement until the cops showed up, but when we went downstairs she was gone. Just vanished. There was no other way out of the basement. The cops took my statement and eventually we settled on the idea that she hadn't run into the basement and I had mistaken which door she used in the heat of the moment. They never found her, but I started seeing her in the mirrors. First just the one in the basement, then all throughout the house. Moved to another house and it stopped for a bit. Then it got worse. Even in the mirrors at work, I saw her. I put the drapes up at home to get some peace. I've been doing it ever since. He stopped. My head was still catching up. Can anyone else see her? He laughed, stood up and walked over to the curtain on the wall. You want to know if I'm just going mad? Let's see. He pulled down the curtains and smiled sadly at the mirror. I couldn't see anything while seated, but I stood and froze. An elderly woman stood on the other side of the mirror, behind my grandfather's reflection. I had assumed he had PTSD or something. My mind was breaking. He pulled the curtain shut. "You saw her?" "Not everyone can," he said. "Am I going crazy?" I asked. "I've been asking myself that for years, sweetheart. Sometimes I think your grandmother may have been the only sane one." I finished my visit with him somewhat stunned and went to check into my hotel. I'm staying a few more days. Just before writing this post, my mum called me to see how my visit with Grandpa went. "Talk about anything interesting?" she asked. I couldn't answer. I glanced at the mirror instinctively when she asked and saw my mother's reflection looking back at me. "Hello? Did I lose you?" she said. "Not really, just hospital stuff." "Sorry, I got a text," I said, forcing myself back. After I got off the phone, I put a sheet over the mirror. I'm throwing that away. I'm not going to be sleeping for at least a week at this point. As always, I hope you enjoyed. If you did, then like, comment and subscribe. It helps me out a bunch and I always appreciate it. Yeah, I don't really know what else to say. I'm really creeped out. I guess I'll see you whenever I next see you.